Hello. These are the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and even a little bit of a homily for the 8th Sunday of the year, the last Sunday this year before the beginning of Lent. And a little bit of a help in a way to understand a word, especially in the gospel, that we use quite often in our lives. The first reading is from the book of Sirach, this wisdom book that contains a lot of short, pithy little sayings, but today kind of brings up something that coincides with the gospel. When a sieve is shaken, the husks appear. So do one's faults when one speaks. As the test of what the potter molds is in the furnace, so in tribulation is the test of the just. The fruit of a tree shows the care it has. So too does one's speech disclose the bent of one's mind. Praise no one before they speak, for it is then that people are tested. The second reading is again from Paul's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that famous chapter that deals with Jesus and our resurrections. Brothers and sisters, when this which is corruptible clothes itself with incorruptibility, and this which is mortal clothes itself with immortality, then the word that is written shall come about. Death is swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be firm, steadfast, always fully devoted to the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And the gospel is again from Luke's Sermon on the Plain, that passage that parallels the better known Sermon on the Mount of Matthew, but was probably taken from the Q source, that same scroll that contained a whole bunch of sayings of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus told his disciples a parable. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? No disciple is superior to the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me remove that splinter in your eye, when you do not even notice the wooden beam in your own eye? You hypocrite! Remove the wooden beam from your eye first, then you will see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye. A good tree does not bear rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For people do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor do they gather grapes from brambles. A good person out of the store of goodness in their heart produces good, but an evil person out of a store of evil produces evil. For from the fullness of the heart the mouth speaks. The word of the Lord. I comment often that during the O.J. Simpson trial, somebody interviewed the comedian George Carlin. And to my surprise, I found out he claimed he was watching every minute of that trial on television. And when they asked him, why are you doing that? His first response was, well, I need the material. But his second response made even more sense. He said, I watch it because people are only their true selves when they're under pressure. If they're not under pressure, they can pretend to be somebody else. And in a way, that's exactly what Jesus of Nazareth says. Especially, for instance, when you're dealing with people who are not really doing what he asks them to do. He refers to them as hypocrites. And we today will sometimes throw that particular word out to condemn people. You're just a hypocrite, which means you're doing something, but you're not really doing it out of your heart, or you're not doing it correctly. You're just pretending to do it. I often remind my students that the word hypocrite in Greek was not a bad word. It wasn't pejorative. The word hypocrite was simply the word for an actor or an actress. If I'm not mistaken, last week we had a special program most of us saw on television called the Academy Awards. And the Academy Awards basically consisted in giving awards to the best hypocrites of the last year, to the best actors and actresses. But when you're dealing with faith and you're called a hypocrite by Jesus, that's a very pejorative term, because it's easy in our own lives to confuse the character we pretend to be with the character that we actually are. And Jesus doesn't want those type of people around in his community. I often quote Rita Hayworth, who, when she was asked one time how come she was married 5 times, her answer was classic. She says, well, most of the guys who married me thought they were marrying Gilda, this rather provocative character from that mid-40s movie that was so popular. She said, the problem is, though, they go to bed with Gilda, but the next morning they wake up and realize it's Rita next to him. I'm not that character. And very obviously, Jesus says, you should be the character that you pretend to be, or stop pretending to be it. When we see that, for instance, we have to realize that sometimes it's only, as Carlin said, it's under pressure that we really are our true selves. And that pressure, especially in the Gospels, the pressure that the historical Jesus seemed to give to people, was to imitate him. When we do that, we're certainly under a pressure that we wouldn't be at any other time, because we are suffering then as he suffers. That's why, as I said, perhaps the most famous line in today's Sermon on the Plain is the one about taking the splinter out of your brother's eye and forgetting you have a huge beam in your own eye. When you confront people sometimes who have addictions to certain things, they defend themselves by trying to show there's somebody out there who's worse than I am. If you think I'm an alcoholic, I don't drink till 7 o'clock in the morning. The guy across the street, now that's a real alcoholic. He starts drinking at 6:30 in the morning. We always slough off who we are in order to bring up somebody who's worse than we are. Jesus simply says, and Paul agrees with him, we should be who we are with no comparison to anyone else. Only we are the ones who somehow or another have to defend who we are. And it isn't just a matter of clicking off sins. I remember the prerequisite for going to confession was you had to learn a list of sins. And it didn't happen to me personally, but some other priests that I know says, we used to learn that list of sins from a little card that our teachers passed out to us with the 10 Commandments on it. And we just kind of click off those particular commandments and those particular sins, and then confess those that had been clicked off. Some kids, as I mentioned, did that so much in a rote way that when they finished their sins, they would say, copyright Benzinger Brothers, 1945 or something. They would actually go down that card with the list on and read the copyright at the bottom of the list. That's how rote some of those sins were. And also how ridiculous some of the sins were when you had, for instance, 6 and 7-year-old kids confessing murders or confessing adultery or confessing other things that we'd look at and say, how could you do that? But at the same time, they simply had to have some sins. Jesus doesn't really ask us to set up a list of sins and then start clicking them off. He asks us, on the contrary, to set up an ideal world that he wishes us to create. And then asks us, what are we doing to create that? What are we not doing in that sense of sins? What are we not doing in that sense of creating a new place? That's why when he talks about producing fruit, he's not saying go through if you're a tree and find out how much rotten fruit you got. He says go through it and find out how much fruit you don't have, period. How are you not doing what I ask you to do as my followers? That's why we have much more difficulty in being Christians. If being Christian simply means the one with the least check marks gets into heaven, we're not really reading the gospel Jesus or understanding the risen Jesus in our life. We have to understand, looking at it, that we are to produce something. What Jesus examines us on isn't what we've done wrong, it's what we haven't done good. That's why I've sometimes encouraged people that we should examine our consciences not at night when we go to bed, but in the morning when we get up. And our conscience, somehow or another, should be a reflection on the areas or the occasions during that coming day that we know in advance we could do some good. Not at the end of the day to say, oops, I slipped up on here or I did that bad. Rather, what if I didn't reflect on it could I totally miss in my life? What occasion would be there where I could help somebody or do something good for an individual that otherwise, if I didn't think of it in advance, I might totally miss it. So it might sound strange to bring up George Carlin when you're talking about a homily. He was Catholic, though. But on the other hand, we have to understand the pressure that Carlin brought up in that trial. Jesus of Nazareth would say, we should be bringing pressure into our life by trying to imitate him. That type of pressure, basically in the long run, tells us whether we're Christians or just somebody who's acting as Christians, simply to carry out some particular expectation that people have of us instead of who we really are. I think Jesus would much rather regard us as sinners, and really sinners who admit that we are, as he did during his earthly ministry, than to have us try to pass as saints, but we're simply doing it because we read what saints should say or do or look like in some nice, holy, pious, religious book. One of the worst things Jesus could accuse us of is, you're simply acting. And my followers should never be actors. For good or bad, they should be real people. Thank you.